although I was introduced as a tropical field biologist, I grew up in Beverley in East Yorkshire, and my first experiences of seeing reasonably large wild mammals was watching badgers. So I've had a lifelong interest in the species, even though my work has taken me to Africa and Southeast Asia, and I'm better known for my observations of gorillas in the mist rather than badgers in the mist. But forest animals with some black and some white in the mist is a sort of a theme here. And the other theme I want to stress during this talk is our perception of what these animals do. Why are they important? And if you ask the average person in the street why badgers are important, if they haven't had their minds polluted by this unproven connection with bovine tuberculosis transmission, I say unproven. In most circumstances, badgers don't transmit bovine TB to cattle, but it does live in the soil around both species. If they haven't got that on their minds, they'll probably have a very positive idea of badgers. So what was interesting about this was earlier this year in the snowy weather, my camera trap happened to catch a couple of badgers doing what badgers do in the late winter, early spring. You might have to wait a moment for that to happen. There we go, a little bit of courtship and eventually badgers bonking in the rain. And a week ago, I also put my camera trap up to see if I could get some cub action. And I haven't yet uploaded it to YouTube, but keep an eye on my channel because in the next week or two, I will do so. Got some lovely behavior of 4 or 5 badgers, quite large cubs and older ones playing outside the set. So this is the badger action to start. It's downhill all the way from here, I'm afraid. But people, if you're asking this mythical person in the street about badgers, they probably won't know a lot about the natural history. They won't have an idea of their importance in the woodland ecosystem. And that's a theme that I want to return to time and again during this talk, because people tend to look at animals, especially attractive ones, fluffy ones, as kind of nice things to see. And of course they are, but that's not what they're for. So a lot of my talk will be talking about species that seem a long way from us, but when you consider what they do, what their role is in their ecosystem, then that question, well, what are they for? What do they do? Becomes more relevant, particularly in the year where the UK is about to host COP26. For those who aren't familiar with UN numbering of meetings, COP26 is the 26th Conference of the Parties, COP, of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And you might not have thought that gorillas or elephants or badgers for that matter were particularly relevant to climate change, except that if we mess the climate up, then of course they, like every other species and every other person on the planet, will suffer. So wanting to avoid suffering is a good reason for considering them in the context of climate change. But let me first of all, from my boyhood in Beverley, I studied biology at Keele University with geology for the first couple of years, and then had the ridiculous good fortune to go and work as Diane Foss's research assistant, studying mountain gorillas. And this particular gorilla, in this photograph, an adult silverback male, was the first gorilla I saw. But when I first saw him in 1976, he was an infant, and he was being chased up a tree by his younger brother, Quayle. And his name given to him by Kelly Stewart, another gorilla researcher who had been reading the book Titus Grown. She called him Titus because she saw him on the first day of his life. So he's a gorilla who was studied throughout his life, and sadly he's no longer with us. He died at the what for a silverback seems to be a ripe old age of 35. In captivity, some gorillas have lived into their 40s and even 50s, and some chimpanzees have lived into their 60s, and orangutans. So apes have a longer lifespan in the best captivity than they do in the wild. But in the wild, of course, they're doing more than just existing. They're part of this ecosystem. Now, mountain gorillas, as some of you may know, share their habitat with many species, including forest elephants. And forest elephants hit the news earlier this year because the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, finally, after years of people writing papers and expressing this view, recognized that the forest elephant in Africa is a different species to the savanna elephant. They're smaller, they have rounder ears, and their tusks point downwards. So they are Loxodontus cyclotis, and that is the species you see here. And these particular forest elephants have just interacted with a group of gorillas, which was a very exciting moment for me. There are very few forest elephants left in the gorilla habitat of the Virunga volcanoes, and these had come across from the Congo side, the Democratic Republic of Congo, into Rwanda, and had a fairly peaceful but interesting interaction with a group of gorillas, where the young male elephant stuck his ears out and sort of threatened the young silverback in the group. And the young silverback stood up and beat his chest at the elephants, and the elephants backed away. So 3 times I saw this happen. There was a bit of a face-off, and the elephants backed down, and the silverback presumably felt very chuffed that he had won the day in this strange encounter. So this is a lovely photograph by Barbara Mast, just to remind you of the other topic in the talk. So arriving at Karisoki, I was introduced to the method of working with the gorillas, which was to go out each day with a pencil and notebook and sit and observe them, get to know the individuals and monitor their behavior, what they're feeding on, who they sit next to, who they groom. And there was a wonderful moment a few months in where it became apparent that particularly some of the younger gorillas were not just tolerating me, they actually chose to come and sit by me. And at the time, it was a wonderful thing. We no longer do that because with so many people coming on gorilla watching holidays from all over the world, and particularly in the current climate with the pandemic, people are more aware of the risks of droplet infection or even aerosol infection of respiratory viruses. This sort of close contact is no longer allowed. Many people's introduction to mountain gorillas, particularly if they're old enough to remember this movie or have watched it on streaming services, was the film starring Sigourney Weaver in the role of Diane Fossey and Brian Brown playing Bob Campbell, the National Geographic photographer. And it was, of course, a dramatization of some aspects of Diane's life. And the scene that you're looking at in the center there was actually an actor in a gorilla suit, but many of the scenes were actual mountain gorillas interacting with Sigourney Weaver. And indeed, before she was given the role, before they signed the contract with her, they took her out for a field test to see how she would behave in the midst of a family of gorillas with a silverback strutting by. And she played it very well. And she has maintained an interest in gorilla conservation and serves as an honorary president to the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund International. But that was a drama, not a documentary. When you watch the real gorilla behavior, you're watching real gorilla behavior, so you can learn from that. And as I say, some aspects of Diane's life were portrayed, but a lot of it was Hollywood fabrication, like sharing a bath. But this was more the reality. Living in a corrugated iron shack at 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters above sea level in a montane rainforest, surrounded by communities some of whom traditionally saw the forest as a hunting ground. Not that they hunted gorillas in this area. Very rarely did someone kill a gorilla deliberately, but occasionally a gorilla, if it charged a hunter, might get speared. The hunter would argue in self-defense, but mostly the poachers, because this is Africa's first national park, declared in 1925 by the Belgian king when it was part of the Belgian Congo, and it was declared to protect the gorillas and this habitat. And so people whose great-grandfathers used to hunt here were then told, well, this is now a protected area, you're not allowed to. And that conflict between traditional hunting, for food and conservation is one that echoes around the world. And it's a very difficult one to solve, particularly in a country like Rwanda and southwest Uganda, where the human population density is so high and all the land is cultivated. It looks like a huge market garden, or like a giant allotment, with lots of families living in little plots of land and no natural habitat at all. There's no way that wildlife can survive in that intensively cultivated habitat. So anyone sneaking into the forest, which according to their culture is the source of wild meat, wild honey, wild herbs and medicines, was technically breaking the law, and many of them were arrested. And Diane found herself, she was there to do research, which is what the picture on the right indicates. Her research was so successful that that the gorilla families came to trust her so much that they would even let their infants approach her, as you see there. This is Poppy, an infant, investigating Diane, as Diane takes notes, investigating the gorillas. That sort of encounter was magical, but as I say, because of concerns over transmission of respiratory viruses and other pathogens, we endeavour now to maintain a 10-metre distance. So these are historical photographs. Please see them in that context. And the other photograph is also historical, of Diane with one of her anti-poacher patrols that she organised and paid the men to go out and cut snares, and had captured a teenager working with his dad. And although he's smaller than the others, that's because he's a member of the Batwa tribe, which is a pygmoid tribe that traditionally hunted in these forests. And they've had perhaps the roughest deal out of the conservation. And that's one of the reasons why I'm particularly proud that the Guerrilla organisation, the UK charity that grew out of Diane's work, funds the education of and the sustainable development of Batwa communities. And they're having to change their traditional way of life because there just isn't enough forest left for them to be a hunter-gatherer. But anyway, this was back in the 70s with Diane organising anti-poaching patrols, and this young chap was taken to the authorities because he was hunting illegally. And what you see on the table there, apart from a spear, is a dead bush buck which has been butchered and wrapped up in its own skin. The skin has a value and the meat has a value. Many other people became aware of Diane's work through the film that David Attenborough made in 1978. It was broadcast in 1979, so 42 years ago now, which was the primate program of Life on Earth. And Life on Earth, you may remember, was a 13-part series, 13 one-hour programs looking at every species on Earth that the BBC could get a film of, and that David Attenborough was, walking into one scene speaking and then walking into another scene on a different continent, continuing the same sentence. So really breaking the grounds of presenting natural history. But the only sequence that most people remember is the one where he got sat upon by a juvenile gorilla called Pablo. And Pablo was a juvenile delinquent, you might say. And he too grew up into a splendid silverback, lived to the age of 35, fathered loads of kids. He and Titus, I think, held a record for the most offspring fathered. So they did very well in life. So David is still with us and making programs, but he hasn't been back to be sat upon by gorillas, and that wouldn't be allowed now because of the 10-metre rule. For those unfamiliar with the geography, this is where Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, previously known as Zaire, meet. And it's where they meet at that three-point junction there that is the habitat of the mountain gorillas. That and this forest further north in Uganda. Now, this map is from a few years ago, so these numbers have gone up. This is no longer 320 in Bwindi, it's about 420. And in the Virunga Massif, the Virunga National Park goes all the way up north of Lake Edward to the Ruwenzori's, but the gorillas only live, the mountain gorillas only live in this part. So these two little pockets of forest, this does extend a little bit into the DRC there in a little reserve called Serambwe. Those are the only two habitats of mountain gorillas, and together they now number just over 1,000. So their numbers have been going up in the recent years because of the successful conservation work. And that has been fantastic. Mountain gorillas are the only kind of ape, apart from humans, whose numbers are growing. We're up at 7.5 billion and rising. They've just got back into four figures with just over 1,000. Life for mountain gorilla is pretty relaxed when there aren't any poachers around. They wake up in their nest in the morning. Sometimes they have breakfast in bed, reach out and gather some vegetation and prepare each handful. Titus here is preparing a handful of thistle leaves by stripping the green off the midrib of the leaf, folding them over so that most of the spines are tucked in and they don't get too many prickles, and then biting through that wodge of vegetation. This is actually a video that isn't playing of a female gorilla selecting sedge flowers into a nice little bunch, and it looks like a bunch of flowers, but then she pops it in her mouth and eats it. So you love it when your videos don't play. And their behavior in gathering and preparing food is fascinating to watch, but ecologically, their droppings are possibly more important. Gorillas have an impact on the vegetation. They break branches, they prune trees, they eat fruit, and they swallow the seeds. And what you can see here very clearly, I'm sure you'll all recognize that as a rather unripe blackberry. The gorillas like blackberries so much they eat them even when they're green and crunch them up and swallow them. And these are Pygeum africanum, the African cherry, for which gorillas act as a seed dispersal agent. And this is one of the ways in which gorillas play an important role in their forest habitat. They are thoughtful animals. And when I say that, I mean it. They sit and apparently ponder, and they work things out. But you don't get to... Okay, my PowerPoint is not working properly. And we've suddenly, for some reason, gone right to the back of the talk for reasons I don't understand. So we're just going to skip back to here and carry on from here. Yes, so Diane was in a situation where she was working in Rwanda on a research permit, but around her, people were breaking the law. So some would say she took the law into her own hands. Some would say she, as a temporary citizen of Rwanda, she was an American citizen, but she had lived there for so long that she was effecting citizens' arrests. And she was organizing local farmers who she had previously hired to help with tracking the gorillas or cutting wood at camp or doing jobs to do anti-poacher patrols and cut the snares. Because the snares were set for antelope, but they would sometimes catch gorillas, and baby gorillas were dying as a result of the injuries inflicted by these snares. So this is one of the informal anti-poacher patrols that Diane organized. And some people feel that that is why she was murdered. There may be other reasons. The murder is essentially unsolved, although there are many theories. And if you want to look it up, there's a book called Murders in the Mist, which talks about Diane and other people killed. And that concludes that it was more local politicians that felt she was getting in the way of their illegal or aspirational activities, wanting to make a profit out of the park. And this was before guerrilla tourism. Rwanda has changed so much in the 40 years since these days. And now much of a large chunk of the country's economy is based on ecotourism, and the protection of the park is far, far better. There are still some snares set, and there is a team of vets called Gorilla Doctors. You can look them up online, and they do really interesting blogs where they check on the health of the gorillas. And if an infant gets caught in a snare now, it's a much rarer event, but there are vets on hand to dart the infant or dart the mother and then release the infant from the snare with appropriate treatment. So Diane was murdered, but her example, the example she set to people, led to even more conservation activity after her death. And one of those activities was the ecotourism. Some of you may even have been to see gorillas, and if so, thank you, because your gorilla watching permits are what pay the rangers and put money into the local communities to encourage them to want to conserve the gorillas, which conserves the forest, which benefits everyone who lives around the park because that controls the runoff of water and generates rainfall. So it's really a virtuous cycle of protecting gorillas, protecting forests, benefiting from those ecosystem services, which in the past had barely been recognized, and which now, as we move up towards COP26, are actually being valued because, of course, these forests are sequestering and storing carbon. We'll come on to that later. For the bigger story, going back to the 70s and the development of gorilla watching based on the same research methods that Diane had developed for studying the gorillas, people could now go on holiday and watch them. And it turned out, as the years went by, that there were more babies and better survival of those babies in the groups that were habituated for tourism or research than in the completely wild groups. So as a conservation mechanism, it has a really good track record. And this is one of a female with a newborn baby, with her older infant, who is now a juvenile and having to build his own nest next to mum each night, as she's now got a new baby in arms. Now, all the great apes, all the apes, gibbons as well as the great apes, are staring extinction in the face. And that's why in back end of 1996, I convened a group of ape organizations, the Jane Goodall Institute, the International Primate Protection League, the Guerrilla Organization, Born Free Foundation, all the organizations that were either dedicated to the Orangutan Foundation, dedicated to apes, or had apes within their multi-species conservation work. And we set up an alliance to try and bring some action for apes to turn around the declining populations. We have not yet succeeded, except for the mountain gorillas. But if you go to 4apes.com, you'll find, well, we'll find that we divided ourselves up into different working groups. The Bushmeat working group is the one that many people find most disturbing, because if you grow up in a village where killing gorillas and eating their meat, or killing chimpanzees or orangutans, then that's your cultural norm. And I think it's really important not to demonize people who happen to grow up in a different culture. But they do need to understand that these are not species that can be hunted sustainably at anything like the level that they are being hunted now. That's why their populations are declining. They're losing their habitat to human agricultural expansion, mines, roads, railways, pipelines, crisscrossing the forests. And that provides access to hunters and transport routes out of the forest, so that the meat from the forest ends up in the market stalls. This is in Pointe Noire, the city in Congo, Brazzaville, not the Democratic Republic, the other Congo. And here they were selling legally shot species. It's perfectly legal to sell game meat if it's not from a protected species. But we do know that under the counter, you can buy illegal meat as long as you are a trusted customer. And when you go out with the hunters, and when you meet their families, it's awfully hard to say that they must not do what they're doing, because this child is the son of a bushmeat hunter. This lady is married. Her well-being and her child's well-being depend on how many animals he kills. If he kills enough, then they might have enough food for a pair of shoes and school fees and medical fees. So you have to look at this picture in the whole. But at the moment, we are not succeeding in providing people like that with a sustainable livelihood. And the forests are being emptied of meat and of valuable timber. And although great steps have been made to certify much of the timber production, it's not all certified. And the certification schemes like the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, every year or two, some investigative journalist reveals a flaw in the system because the profits are huge. Tropical hardwoods are very valuable. And when you build a road and drive lorry loads of logs down to the port to be exported, traditionally from West Africa to Central Africa, it was mainly going to Europe. Now much of that timber is going to China. But the factories in China are producing furniture that we buy. So we still have a role to play in the deforestation of the world's tropical forests. And as a sort of a sideline, the defaunation, the removal of the animals. What you see here is a duiker, a forest antelope, not unlike a muntjac in shape, similar habitat, but muntjac deer. This is an antelope, and it's been killed by a farmer living on the side of the road. Perhaps it was eating his crops, and he thought, great, I can turn that into money by hanging it up on a stick. The truck driver driving by will see that and think, hey, there's $50. I'll buy that for 50, sell it for 100. Because he's got the transport to take it into town. So often tucked in between the logs of these lorries are bundles of bushmeat. And they're just providing a service, taking a product from the source to the market, and they make a few quid, and the farmer makes a few quid, but the forest has one less mammal. And as Africa's, this is also an animation. I'm sorry, my animations are not working today. And I just realized why I put the file in the wrong place. Anyway, this is an animation you can find online in a report called Great Apes, The Road Ahead. And it was actually published in 2002 by the United Nations Great Ape Survival Partnership, GRASP. It was the first report we did. And it was predicting that in Africa by 2030, only 10% of great apes' habitat would remain free of that kind of infrastructure development, roads and railways, towns and plantations. And in Southeast Asia, only 1%. And then they redid the figures 5 years later and found that Southeast Asia is going to be by 2020. And now we're in 2021. And I think we're bang on target. We are still removing habitat from the great apes, and fewer populations can intermingle with each other. You're getting less and less gene flow because there are barriers to movement of individuals. And what we hadn't realized before is that that is going to affect us all. If you look at the conservation literature of 20, 30 years ago, we needed to protect apes because they share a lot of DNA with us and we like them. But they play a really critical role in the ecology of the forest, the health of the forest. And we now realize that these forests are important for climate stability. I think we've realized that for a long time, but now even politicians are realizing it. And you get the meeting like last week's G7 meeting where they're talking about climate change and stopping deforestation. I mean, how it is that 40 years on, we still haven't stopped deforestation, I don't know. And it's very easy for us to look at the guy with the chainsaw and say, well, lock him up. He shouldn't be cutting down trees, but we're paying his wages because we buy the products that the wood gets made into. And in fact, this guy was just clearing a road because a tree had fallen down over the road. So on that occasion, the man with the chainsaw was a hero because he cleared the traffic jam. He opened up the road and the trucks could continue to take the products of the forest to the city and to the port. And it's not just the logs. This is so depressing. When you drive around Africa, you see these bags on the side of the road, and you might think, oh, well, they're probably potatoes or some crop that are being sold in town. But actually, this is charcoal, because most families in Africa don't have access to or can't afford gas or electricity to cook their food. So they either use firewood or charcoal. And the further away they are from the forest, the harder it is to get firewood because it's heavier. So making charcoal makes the cargo lighter and you get a different fuel. But that's where much of the bushes and trees in Africa are ending up. I've seen this at first hand in my other study site, because as well as the gorillas of the Virunga volcanoes, I studied elephants on Mount Elgon, which is another volcano, an extinct volcano on the Kenya-Uganda border. This is on the Kenya side, where there's a problem of illegal charcoal making. And this charcoal gang that we had disturbed had also been disturbed by elephants. There were frightened elephants all around us, trumpeting and not at all being conducive to my observations or attempts to film them. These are the famous underground elephants of Mount Elgon. And they go underground because Elgon, the forests are growing in soils that have been leached of soluble salts. And all herbivores, if they're feeding on plants that grow on soils that are leached in soluble salts, end up salt hungry. And that's why so many of the good lodges in East Africa are built beside natural salt licks, because animals will come and dig up or lick and eat the earth. It's called geophagy. And these elephants have been eating earth and rock. And that's why they've got such short, stumpy tusks, because they go into caves deep underground and use their tusks like living chisels to scrape off and chip off bits of rock, which they then consume, and it's carried out of the cave in their stomach. And this is an extraordinary example of elephant culture, because the baby elephants don't know that their family is the only family of elephants, or that their population of elephants is the only one in the world that goes underground. They think this is what every elephant does, because that's what they do. As I say, you've got to understand the cultural upbringing of complex social mammals, whether they're humans or gorillas or elephants. They learn stuff during their long extended childhood. And what these little elephants learn is that mum takes you into a dark cave and and dig rock, and that balances your diet. We're talking about badgers, they burrow too. And that's another unexpected comparison between the impact of burrowing animals in British and European woodlands compared to there. They shape the habitat, and the digging up of soils from underground can reveal all sorts of things, and it changes the makeup of the soil. So looking around the badger set, you can see there's a huge amount of earth has been moved. The one behind my house, actually, they're digging into a sort of Victorian rubbish dump. So they keep throwing up old pots of marmalade and bottles with Victorian insignia on. So it's a fascinating place for an archaeologist as well as a badger watcher. Sorry, back to elephants. So here's one of the elephants in the dark, feeling their way in the dark. This is taken with a flash photograph, and only after the elephants have become used to me as an observer in the cave with them, which was interesting, as you might imagine, sharing a very large cave with a large herd of elephants. But this shows the actual tusking in action, feeling on the rock with the tip of the trunk, and then chiseling off lumps of rock and catching it before it falls into the mud in the dark with your one hand or your trunk, and conveying that bit of rock into your mouth. Of course, we humans have other uses for elephant tusks, and for a long time people thought that this was the height of sophistication, to have an ivory carving on your mantelpiece. And that desire for ivory carvings has led to the catastrophic decline of elephants across Africa over the past 100 years. It is estimated that a century ago there were probably 10 million elephants, and now there are fewer than 500,000. And now that we recognize there are two separate species, these are forest elephant tusks, which tend to be brownish on the outside and slightly pink or yellowy on the inside, and a harder ivory than the better known savanna elephants. And just to complicate things, Elgon's elephants are savanna elephants genetically, but they live in forests, so it ain't always as simple as you think. It was the loss of several of my study animals on Mount Elgon that prompted me to set up the African Elephant in 1987, and then 2 years later launch the Elefriends campaign with Will Travers of the Born Free Foundation and Care for the Wild and WUSPA, what was then WUSPA is now now the name's gone out of my head. A coalition of animal organizations launched this campaign to try and dissuade people from buying ivory. To be an Elefriend, we simply asked people to sign a pledge saying, I promise not to buy or sell or wear or display ivory. And in doing so, reduce the demand. And we've reduced the demand in much of the world. And even China now has closed down its ivory markets. But you can still see on souvenir stalls in some places. This was actually in Lagos International Airport, an ivory store. And of course, if any customs officer sees that as you come into the country, in the UK or Europe or America, if they x-ray your case, you'll be arrested and it will be confiscated. But the guy who sells it doesn't really mind that, as long as he gets the price of the ivory. So we need to change our concept of elephants from being a producer of this dentine, which we call ivory and make into ornaments, and see them as gardeners of the forest. If gorillas and orangutans and chimpanzees are gardeners of the forest, elephants are mega gardeners of the forest. They play such an important role. And trying to understand that is part of what, of course, an ecologist does. And it can lead to some fascinating and quite exciting encounters. This was me having a 6-minute conversation with a young male elephant called Nick, which you can find on my YouTube channel, but we already established my videos aren't working today. Now, Kenya has taken a lead in trying to dissuade the world from seeing ivory as a commodity and valuing living elephants. Although, to be fair, Kenya has mainly seen the value of living elephants in terms of their ecotourism potential. And that, of course, has been catastrophic in the last year and a half because of the COVID restrictions on travel. So countries such as Kenya that depend on ecotourism based on elephants, or Rwanda and Uganda that depend on it largely based on gorillas or chimpanzees, their conservation work is really suffering through lack of funds And the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, the charities that help them are also suffering from lack of funds because people haven't been able to work normally. They can't necessarily give the donations. They can't, sponsored runs or big balls to raise money. A lot of the things that have funded conservation have been affected by the COVID-19 restrictions. This was in 2016 when Kenya burnt its stockpile of ivory for the third time, I think it was, but this was the biggest bonfire, telling the world, and there was more press photographers than I've ever seen in one place at once, filming this to send out the message that ivory has no value if it's not attached to an elephant. The value that I want you to consider is the value of elephant poo, the positive power of poo. Elephants produce roughly 1 metric ton of first-class organic manure every week. Obviously, bigger elephants produce more and smaller elephants produce less, but that gives you an order of magnitude. So if 100 years ago there were 10 million elephants, just consider, that's 10 million tons of dung every week, 52 weeks a year, non-stop, converting vegetation into nutrients for the soils of Africa. Think of the productivity of those soils compared to now when there's fewer than 500,000 elephants, and not scattered across the whole continent, isolated in little pockets of habitat, sometimes with too many in one spot, but they can't move around as they normally do. What you're seeing there is a kind of seedling nursery you get a few weeks after an elephant deposits a pile of poo, because that dung is often full of seeds because they've been feeding on pods or fruit, and that's the trees of tomorrow. Gorillas do the same, and they seem so big and powerful. You think, why are they endangered? Because to a man with a gun, that's a very easy target. And gorillas' habit of standing up and shouting at you, if you are cool enough and calm enough to hold a weapon, be it a bow and arrow or a gun, you can kill a gorilla fairly easily. And the fact that in some African cultures, gorilla meat is considered big men's meat. If you're an army officer and you want to host other army officers and you're from that culture, then you send out a guy with a gun to kill a gorilla, because it would be disrespectful to your guests if you didn't serve them this important meat. That's the sort of cultural tradition we need to change. And in sometimes just down the road, another tribe would say, we don't kill gorillas. They're our totem animal. We really respect them. They're like our neighbors in the forest. And you kind of want to big up that culture and dissuade people from following the other culture. And that's often left to the rangers. Rangers are the unsung heroes of the fight to prevent dangerous climate change and the fight to prevent biodiversity loss, because they're the guys and the girls sometimes on the ground who have to face armed poachers. And the NGOs like Born Free can help by buying a vehicle, but whether it's a government employed ranger, as these are in Kahuzi-Biega National Park, protecting the eastern lowland gorillas in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or whether it's community rangers in a reserve that they can still access for traditional purposes, but not for hunting, or whether it's a private sector. There are some conservation areas now owned by the private sector that hire rangers to protect the wildlife, usually associated with tourism. And all those efforts to prevent the destruction of habitat are constantly facing the much bigger, better financed efforts of the extractive industries. And particularly in the poorer countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where these two lads live and work, and they're deep underground, at a hole in the ground with a two-cell battery, two-cell torch strapped to their head with a bit of string or fabric, using a lump hammer and chisel to hammer out the ore. And the ore that they're hammering out could end up in your mobile phone, or my mobile phone, or the laptop that I'm speaking to you through. And it's extraordinary that the wealthiest businesses in the world have not sorted it out so that they are using minerals that are conflict-free. They're not from mines where child labor and forced labor is digging out the minerals by hand. I contributed to this report that the United Nations and Interpol co-produced, Last Stand of the Gorilla, because in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, it isn't just child labor and forced labor and sometimes rape and atrocities committed to get these minerals out of the ground and into our devices, it's impacting the wildlife and the habitats and the people who aren't in the mine, because when the area is so insecure, people aren't going to go there on a holiday to see gorillas because it's too unsafe. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office says don't travel to Eastern DRC, and yet the gorillas there are as friendly and welcoming as the ones in Rwanda and Uganda, but your travel insurance doesn't cover you unless you take out hostile territories insurance like war correspondents do, and most tourists ain't going to do that. So you have a place where normal business that might support nature conservation hasn't been able to flourish, even though this is the area where guerrilla tourism first began in the 1970s. And instead, the extractive industries are constantly looking for the loopholes in the legislation or the weakest countries where they can go in, build a mine with a minimum amount of environmental regulations and get the ores out to where they're needed, whether it's Europe or China or Australia. So that's where these particular ores go to and eastern lowland gorillas live in a habitat that grows on land that is rich in one particular mineral called coltan. It's an ore of tantalum. And we all have tantalum capacitors in our phones and laptops because they're very good at reducing the size of circuitry, which is why we have such small phones now instead of bricks to the side of our head, as we were doing a few years ago. So while this is going on, gorillas are being killed, either directly, deliberately, or accidentally. And that's reducing the number of gorillas doing what Muguruza is doing here, eating fruit, which means there are fewer piles of poo the next day with seeds in. And we try and put papers describing this effect of defaunation and the effect of the forest on the 4apes.com website. This is another pile of poo. This is cross-river gorilla poo. It's the rarest kind of gorilla. There are fewer than 300 of them in the world. They live only on the border between Cameroon and Nigeria. And in that part of Cameroon, there is civil unrest because of the conflict between the Anglophone part of Cameroon and the Francophone part of Cameroon. So very difficult to do conservation work there. And on the Nigerian side, it's more stable, but there are very large vested interests trying to get at the forest, take out the timber and sell it, even though there's so little of it left. And the cross-river gorillas, why are they important? Because if you want trees tomorrow, at least in 100 or 200 years' time, you need the gorillas eating the fruit and pooing the seeds today to do that. And oddly enough, that happens with badgers too. And my videos aren't working. So this is a video of a badger jumping up one of my plum trees in my orchard in Stroud and shaking the trunk and then eating the plums. And if you look at the badger poo next day, here's another badger eating a plum. You'll have to go to the YouTube channel to watch these. Yeah, so English woodland. Badgers are important seed dispersal agents. So are foxes. I've got video of foxes eating the plums in my garden too. You've probably seen it in your garden if you have a plum tree in your garden. So these animals are not just ornaments. They're not just things to go and hunt on horseback. They're not just things to dig out the ground and set dogs on. They are part of the ecology of our woodlands. And increasingly, we're talking about, we're going to rewild. And rewild is putting back species that have been exterminated, and yet we're killing the very species that we haven't yet exterminated at a rate that has never been seen before. I'm so sorry, we're getting badger clips instead of. So look up online, go to Ecosia, which is the search engine that plants trees, rather than other better known search engines, and type in badger seed dispersal, and you get papers like this come up. And it tells you that this was 77% of badger droppings examined contained seeds from one plant species, and most of the seeds were undamaged. So it's seasonal, but they are important seed dispersal agents. So rewilding our forests means protecting our seed dispersal agents. And here is a Iberian pear being dispersed by badgers. What's that going to do with COP26? Some of you may have heard of RED, R-E-D-D. R-E-D-D is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And the plus stands for all the bonus things you get on top of that, like protecting biodiversity and generating livelihoods and protecting rainfall. because forests, of course, generate rain. So this question has been asked since 2007, when the climate talks were held in Bali, and the Bali roadmap was negotiated by the climate negotiators. The climate convention, unlike other UN conventions like CITES, which regulates international trade in endangered species, or the Convention on Migratory Species that I serve as an ambassador for, that obviously, as the name says, protects migratory species. They tend to meet every 3 years. But so important is the climate issue that since the UN Climate Convention was first negotiated and signed by enough countries to put it into action, there's been an annual meeting. That's why they're at COP26, whereas the Convention on Biodiversity, which meets this year in China, the month before we have COP26 in Glasgow, they're only up to COP15. So you have to understand which COP series you're talking about when you do. But this question has been discussed, and now is the Paris Climate Agreement recognizes that forests are important, and the Glasgow Agreement that everyone's hoping will come out of COP26 is the mechanics of how do we get people to fund the protection of forests. And this is in our own interest. This isn't just because gorillas and elephants are nice and we want to save them. This is because we need to maintain a climate and limit the increase in average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. This is a Met Office interactive map that you can find online, which tells you what the world might be like if we get to 4 degrees above average temperature. And what you see at this 4 degrees average temperature rise is that the areas of tropical forest, Congo Basin, Amazonia, and Southeast Asia, the three chambers of the global heart that pumps water vapor around the world because of the evapotranspiration of those forests, they're arid, dry, no rainforest. All those species we're trying to save in rainforests are not going to be able to move to Antarctica to live in whatever habitable land there is there. We might have some farms in areas which were previously frozen, but most of the wildlife won't. And most of the primates, the non-human primates, won't survive that. If you look at the distribution of tropical forests, you'll find that it pretty much matches the distribution of primates. We are tropical forests and savanna woodland species. And that's not a coincidence. It's not that some forest grew and then animals started to live there. It's co-evolution of animals and trees, seed dispersal agents, and the organisms that produce seed. I'm really sorry you're not seeing this one. This is a lovely animated weather map that shows the distribution of water vapor around the world. And you can find it at that website, or just look up T341 rain. If you type T341 rain into a search engine, ideally Ecosia, because then your search helps to plant another tree, you'll get this straight away at the top of the list. It's a lovely animated weather map showing how the water moves around the world in invisible rivers in the sky and then falls on crops globally, driven by the tropical forests. And the kids who live in and around those forests have no idea of the importance of those forests. So when a foreigner turns up with a briefcase full of money and says, right, I'm going to pay you to cut down trees, they think, fantastic, haven't had any money before, we can buy all sorts of things, and they cut down trees. But what we're trying to establish now is a system where people go there and say, we'll pay you to not cut down the trees and to protect the elephants so that seed dispersal continues. Now, many of these communities are living where there is no electricity. So one of the innovations that the Ape Alliance came up with the help of the Great Ape Film Initiative, was pedal power cinemas. So if you look up in the right-hand corner, there's a bloke on a bike, and he's riding a bike on a stand, which is generating the power to project a film onto this screen, so that these kids, most of them have not seen moving pictures before. Imagine that, you're growing up, you're at primary school or secondary school, you've never seen moving pictures because you live where there's no electricity. And unless your dad has taken you to town to sell some potatoes, and you look through a window of a bar and you see a football match on telly, and it transfixes you. And that's kind of all you see on a lot of African public televisions in bars and hotels: football matches, music videos, or news programs. Almost no natural history. So you show these kids gorilla films, and they know the word for gorilla in their local language. And it's that the gorillas live a few miles away, but none of them have ever been to see them. So this shows them something of the wonder of gorillas, and you see their eyes light up. It is wonderful. People in the rest of the world where they used to be online can go even further. This is a website called Ecotourism, virtual ecotourism. And you can go on virtual safaris to see the gorillas in Diego or in other places. And that's important because around the world, we want everyone to understand that if we lose monkeys and birds and gorillas and elephants in these tropical ecosystems, we are damaging our own future because of the importance of these ecosystems in delivering water vapor to the rest of the world through the evapotranspiration and the global rainfall distribution system, and through the sequestration and storage of carbon. So fighting climate change, as you see, means protecting forests and wildlife, not just the trees, but the animals as well. These are the gardeners of the forest. And if we want to protect the forest, we need to protect the gardeners of the forest. And the exciting thing that I wanted to share with you now, I'm going to stop screen sharing this talk to you, is that a new initiative called Rebalance Earth, which that's the website, rebalance.earth, which is looking at, we've calculated the difference that elephants make in a forest in terms of that forest carbon sequestration. Turns out that in the Congo Basin, a forest with elephants sequesters and stores about 7% more carbon than a forest where the elephants have been extirpated by ivory poachers or other hunters. And that 7% difference is a marketable commodity. More and more companies, more and more individuals, you might want to offset your greenhouse gas emissions if you drive a car, or you go on holiday and you think, oh, I'm helping heat the planet. How can I offset that? Well, you can drive less and fly less, but you still want to have a quality of life. So carbon offsets are a way of saying, okay, I'm putting out a bit of CO2 here. I want to make sure it's being absorbed there. Think how wonderful it would be if that absorption was being done by protecting elephants and helping communities that live alongside those elephants get on with their lives with the resources to protect their crops from elephants, and they need to put up a fence, and to value the elephants as a source of their well-being. That's what Rebalance Earth is planning to do, and we're only been going for a few months. Our pilot project is we're hoping going to start in a few months in Gabon, and we'll be telling you more about it as this story gets out, because it is a revolutionary system. It puts the value on living nature rather than the traditional extractive value of nature. If you don't kill the animal or cut down the tree, it's not worth anything unless you can take a tourist to see it. And the tourism, as we've seen, is not necessarily a reliable source of revenue for long-term conservation. If for some reason tourists can't come, if there's a civil war, tourism stops. If there's a pandemic, tourism stops. Whereas paying animals to provide the ecosystem services that they already do provide, but that means that you have the resources to pay the rangers and give the communities alternative livelihoods so they're not dependent on killing animals or cutting down trees. That's going to change everything. So we're very excited about rebalance.earth. Do look it up. And I can see now, because I haven't been looking at the chat box, that there are lots of questions in there.